People look at the depth, for example, they go to Greenland and they look at the ice cores that are dug down, and these long ice cores are created. Oh, there's millions of years of annual layers or whatever. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. The depth of those, it doesn't take that long. After the time of the flood, there would have been a short ice age for just a few hundred years, and that's where the ice accumulated on Antarctica and on Greenland.
Christian apologist Bob Dutko is apparently thinking of glaciation periods, where the thickness of snow and ice would advance glaciers for a while and then retreat and then advance again over and over again for ages. And he's got that confused with an ice age. He doesn't understand that we're still living in an ice age right now, meaning that we have ice at both poles permanently year-round. Ice cores only tell us a tiny part of that story, in addition to tectonic plate movement and pangeographical species and other aspects of paleoclimatology and paleontology around the world. That's why I invited paleoclimatologist Dr. Jonathan Baker to talk about this, and we'll hear from him again in a moment. What scientists have confirmed is that the ice age that we're still living in now began roughly 34 million years ago. And prior to that, the planet experienced very long periods that were much warmer and wetter, where sea levels were significantly higher than they are today because there was no ice at the poles, at least not at both poles at once. I've personally seen the remains of one of these ancient shorelines where Texas was entirely underwater, and the Oklahoma border was then the beach, because at a certain level there are thousands of ammonite fossils visible in one place where their shells evidently washed up on the shore in the surf and piled atop each other over time. It's hard to see that and ignore what it is, because south of that on the Texas side at the same level the fossils are marine, and north of that in Oklahoma they're terrestrial. That means this was a Cretaceous beach, not a global flood. And of course, at lower strata, then the beach is further out. Were we to return to this sort of a climate, then all of our coastal cities would be washed away. There are also chemical indications in worldwide strata at two particular levels, indicating a couple of relatively brief periods of unusually high temperatures, including the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, where global average temperatures rose by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that's like 40 degrees hotter than normal everywhere. And both of these past temperature extremes are associated with volcanic activity. And I've been on two paleontological expeditions, one in the Eocene 50 million years ago, where we didn't find any dinosaurs, but we did find horse-like rhinos and rhino-like horses and extinct crocodilians in what are now the Badlands of Wyoming. Crocodiles can't live in Wyoming anymore. That's too cold of a climate now. I also explored 263 million year old Permian strata in the South African Karoo, where again, there were no dinosaurs, nor mammals either, nor crocodiles, because the Permian predates all of those things. But we did find giant salamanders that lived like crocodiles, and we found large therapsids, which look like they're halfway between reptiles and mammals. None of this is consistent with a global flood. Nothing anywhere is. The scablands of the Pacific Northwest show us unmistakable signs of a repeating series of massive cataclysmic floods occurring around 17,000 years ago, as a result of massive lakes breaking through glacial ice walls over and over again. The ice builds up, there's a lake builds up behind it, the lake gets so heavy, eventually the ice wall cracks, massive flood. So we know what a giant flood would look like, but then everywhere in the world would look like that. If there was a worldwide flood, then the whole world would look like the scablands, and the world doesn't. Calm, constant conditions are the norm. And this is demonstrated here in Texas, but our tallest mountain, which is actually a coral reef, showing that area had been under calm seas for a really long time, because that's the only way to grow coral that big. That can't happen in 1 year, like the Noah's flood. And it certainly can't happen in a tumultuous cataclysm either. Coral won't grow except in calm waters, and it grows really slowly. So we would need at least tens or hundreds of thousands of years of calm seas to grow something that big. There is actually quite a lot of detailed information about all these geologic periods and their climatic conditions known to paleoscientists worldwide. So one of the things that both impresses and depresses me about religious fundamentalists and their ridiculous arguments against reality is how fundamental their misunderstanding must be, where they really can't allow themselves to understand much of anything, or they'll see right through their own distortions. And how desperate is it to grasp at such fundamentally flawed notions as this excuse to justify or try to salvage beliefs that are not only baseless, but that have been profoundly refuted? I'm going to say this over and over throughout this series, but we know there was never a global flood. And not just that there's no evidence for it, but that we have way more than sufficient evidence, compelling evidence against it. It's not just that it couldn't happen, and it couldn't, but we have proof that it didn't happen, even if it could have. And for many more reasons than that, we know and can show that the Earth and the surrounding universe are several orders of magnitude older than what creationists can admit.
It doesn't take that long for all of those layers of ice to form. And one of the examples of that is something, once again, that is censored in your school science books, but it's public information. Look it up. Something called the Lost Squadron. I bet most of you don't even know about the Lost Squadron. Let me tell you what it is. In 1942, you had the United States Air Force that had to ditch some of their planes in Greenland. And so, boom, they landed in Greenland. This is 1942. Okay, the planes are abandoned there, the war's over, they get covered up by snow, and then in the 1980s, the United States government decided we're going to go back and retrieve those planes. So they get to Greenland, where are they? It's just ice everywhere, right? So they're getting sonar to try to find out where they are. Are you ready? They were 246 feet down. 246 feet down. And just so you know, the Associated Press, I give them credit for this, the Associated Press went ahead and reported that. Look it up, okay? It only took 40 years for 246 feet of snow and ice to build on top of that. You gonna tell me 4,000 years is not enough time to create a couple of miles of ice? Of course it is.
So in his little Gish gallop here, he jumps immediately from Mount St. Helens to this example from Greenland. And the context here is that we have, very deep ice cores from Greenland, also Antarctica, and, smaller cores from other glaciers around the world. But the Greenland and Antarctic ice cores are, of course, key in reconstructing our recent past. I mean, the Antarctic ice cores go at least to 800,000 years. There's an attempt now to get that back to over 1 million. And the Greenland ice cores, because they haven't been around as long, they at least go back to the last interglacial 130,000 years ago. And we've got bits of ice that are older than that, but reliably back to 130,000 years. And so if you're a young Earth creationist, you look at this and say, there's obviously this ice had to accumulate in several thousand years. Actually, even less than that, because they've been around for a really long time. And the way he wants to convince you that all of this could happen in a very, very short time is he tells the story of the Lost Squadron. And so here we have a number of planes in about 1942, an air squadron of P-38s and a B-17, if I recall. They were flying off the Atlantic coast of Greenland, made an emergency landing on the ice. Crew was rescued, everyone's good, but the planes were stuck there. And 50 years later, they were, rediscovered using some ground penetrating radar, I believe. They found the planes. Some of them were excavated and recovered. I think others are still lost down there. But they called this the Lost Squadron. I mean, the planes basically disappeared. They landed on the ice. And then, as you can imagine, the planes got buried in snow. And so he's saying, well, when they dug them up, they were about 80 to 90 meters below the surface. And so how long would it take? I mean, this happened in only 50 years. So obviously, this big thickness of ice could accumulate in only 50 years. So you got to tell me that the Greenland ice sheet really needed millions of years to form. And he kind of mixes this up because no, it didn't. It was 130,000 years for the majority of the thickness of the Greenland ice sheet. When we recover those cores, though, most of them are taken from the continental interior of Greenland. This is the driest, the coldest part. And that's where the cores go down almost 3,000 meters, right? So 3,000 meters is a lot compared to 90 meters at the top. Consider also, I mean, if you look at fresh snowfall, it's mostly air. You can take snow and pack it down, a meter of snow, pack it down to a very thin layer of ice if you keep compressing it. And so the thickness of these layers gets smaller and smaller as you go down toward the bottom. And they are minuscule, microscopic when you get down to the very base of the core. So it's not that surprising that you would find a great thickness accumulating in 50 years. But the contrast, what the other context he leaves out, though, is that this Lost Squadron was lost in southeastern Greenland, like one of the snowiest parts of the continent. In the continental interior, where we take those ice cores, it's not very snowy compared to this. It's just too cold and too far inland. So the snowpack accumulates, more than a meter a year on average in this location. And it's not that surprising that you could get this thickness. It's not implausible that you could get this thickness. The other context that's left out, I think, is that the plains today are not where they landed. I mean, they're several kilometers away. That ice moves, and glacial ice does move over time. You need some pretty slow time-lapse photography to actually see that motion, but it is dynamic, especially out toward the edge of the ice sheet. So as that moves over time, you've got crevasses opening up and everything shifting around. Something like a plane is not going to stay at the same level or the same layer as where it started necessarily. And so
That's
a
what I
lot
was
of
going to
this,
ask you. That's what I was going to ask you. With an aircraft, even though it's lightweight to fly and all of that, when you mentioned that it's on a glacier, so you've got an object of some weight sitting on top of essentially water. It is in motion, however slow an ice flow is. So would not a squadron of planes literally over time, 50 years, sink?
sink kind of, and it's more that the ice is deforming around it, right? And as ice is deforming, it can kind of, suck things in.
I would
Or
imagine that anything that's sitting on top of a moving glacier would, in 50 years, be under much of that glacier.
Yeah, I mean, this happens to boulders that end up on the surface of a glacier, and they are well and buried by the time that glacial ice reaches its terminus, right? So if it happens to boulders, which we monitor regularly, why wouldn't it happen to a B-17 bomber? But just looking at the accumulation rate, so everyone's clear, in the center of Greenland, this what we call the Greenland ice sheet project. There's GRIP and GISP are the name of the standard cores. They go back almost 3,000 years. If you look at the top 1,000 years of deposition there, the accumulation rate is on the order of 20 to 30 centimeters per year, right? And so if all of this ice accumulated and since 50 years, since 1942, the 50 years since it was discovered, it would be accumulating at a rate that's like 5 to 7 times higher than what you find in central Greenland. But given the difference in climate, that's not implausible, like I said. So if you factor in that and the dynamics of the glacial flow, like this is not surprising whatsoever. And regardless, it doesn't contradict these well-dated cores from the interior. And we've got cores all around Greenland, including near the coastlines. And those are matched up by several dozen different techniques. We look at isotopes, we look at trace elements, we look at dust, we look at volcanic ashes that show up in them. We look at bubbles, the atmosphere that's trapped inside. And putting that all together, we can link them up not only with each other and confirm that, yes, these are annual layers we are counting, but that they line up with other historically constrained events, including volcanic eruptions over the last few thousand years. So they're recorded in history in Iceland and in Europe and the Mediterranean. And there we find them. Like we know that the dating is accurate. We can also match up climatic events. There's a well-known one about 8,200 years ago, a cooling event that shows up in Greenland. It shows up in Scandinavia very well. It shows up in Central Europe. I found it in Russia. You can find it in North America even. Like it's all over the place, and it happens at the same time everywhere. So we can corroborate the timing of those ice sheets. Sorry, we can corroborate the age model, the chronology of those ice sheets really, really well. Not just with radiometric dating, but other counting techniques and historical documents and so forth. And so it's just kind of silly to deny that. I mean, given that we know with very high certainty that the top 400 meters or so correspond to about the last 2,000 years of history. To get to those deep layers that are very, very, very compact, you need a lot more than 2,000 additional years to accumulate that ice, right?
Thank you for that input. But one other question. He keeps bringing up how all this information is being censored. That it's being hidden from our history books or whatever. You talk about well-known instances, but we're talking about somebody who doesn't know well-known things. He thinks everything
it's a
is
very
secret.
effective rhetorical technique to suggest that this is censored somehow. But in fact, there are nonprofit websites, devoted to learning about, explaining the Lost Squadron, for example, and some of the background there. There are thousands of articles published about the Greenland ice cores and about radiometric dating of not just Mount St. Helens, but other volcanoes around the world. So, I mean, this is accessible to people everywhere. It's not being censored. The story of the Lost Squadron is not covered up. It's not something that embarrasses us. But it's an effective rhetorical technique. And I think the thing that bothers me the most about this dialogue is that he's giving it here in a church audience, right? And he's telling people this, to tie these facts to your faith. And I've been in audiences like this. I remember as a young kid, somebody comes in, you immediately give them some credence, some respect, and they rattle off facts one after another like this, and it's a little gish gallop. I mean, we call it a gish gallop because we know what the strategy is. But if you don't know that, it's easy to take that in, and you won't necessarily fact check it. Or even if you do, a lot of what he says, it's not necessarily factually incorrect. It's just horribly interpreted. So you can look up on the internet and you can find instantly, yes, it was found under 80 meters of snow and ice, right? And
after 50 years,
and if you can't if you can't put that together, the basic dynamics of how ice sheets accumulate, then it's easy to come to that conclusion that it's being censored somehow, or it obviously supports his position. And the reason that bothers me is that it creates this huge distrust in scientists in general, but earth scientists in particular. I see that all the time. People completely distrust what we want to say. And that's, it's very tragic because now you're creating an atmosphere, especially within the US, where young people who may otherwise have grown up to be, very productive scientists and inquirers of nature will avoid it, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the arguments that I get into in social media, like every day, it almost always is the first thing to come up. It's like the universe didn't come from nothing. Well, we don't believe that, but they're going to accuse me of believing that every day. That they're just never going to correct that argument. And then the very next one after that is that all radiometric dating methods are invalid, always invalid. They're never correct.
Yeah, it's unfortunate we get this rap. It's too bad. I mean, I'd love to take them to a lab. Just let's date some samples together and see how the process works, and you'll find that it does work really well. It's quite amazing to this day.